I'm going to give you guys a little taste of OUX, talk through some of the main problems that OUX helps solve, to just kind of give you an idea if this is something for you, if this is something that you want to dive into a little bit deeper, if some of these problems are the problems that you are experiencing in your work life. And then we'll go into some solutions that you can actually use tomorrow. So my goal for the next hour is to make sure that kind of give you an idea on what OUX is, how it can help you, and give you some tangible things that you can actually use and you can bring to your work tomorrow. Okay, so object-oriented UX. So this is all about designing our digital worlds to be as intuitive as the physical world, or as intuitive as possible, as close as we can get. Because the physical world, our brains have evolved in the physical world. Our brains did not evolve in digital worlds. And because of the way that our perception works, which is all very object-oriented, the way that we perceive the world is based on that physical world. But when we go into digital worlds as designers, we can do crazy things because we're not beholden to the laws of physics. So we can break these laws of physics, and it makes perception difficult. It makes it difficult for people to understand these worlds. So we are going to talk a little bit about how object-oriented UX helps you work with your developers. I'm sure you may have heard of object-oriented programming and how developers often think object-orientedly. And that is a great icing on the cake with object-oriented UX. But the real reason that I evangelize object-oriented UX is because our users are thinking object-orientedly, because we are thinking object-orientedly. So even if developers tomorrow started doing something completely different where they were not developing with object-oriented programming, I would still be evangelizing object-oriented UX because this helps with it helps our digital designs play to how human cognition actually works, okay? Which unfortunately, we're not going to get into that too much today. I might go on some side rants about human cognition, but that is usually something we save for some of the longer lectures when we get into all the psychology. It's quite the rabbit hole. So anyways, I'm Sophia Prater, if you're not familiar with me, if we haven't met yet, and I am a UX designer, I'm a UX coach, I'm the chief evangelist for object-oriented UX, and I need to update where I'm headquartered because I am now headquartered just about an hour and a half outside of Atlanta in the North Georgia mountains. So I am staring at the Appalachians right now, which is very, very wonderful. And I've only been up here about a week, so still settling in. So I wrote this article in 2015 called Object-Oriented UX about a year and a half after practicing this way of designing and seeing how well it worked for me. I was very nervous to actually publish this article on such a prestigious and, felt like there was a lot of eyes on me with a list apart, because I really did feel like I was turning the UX process inside out. So as far as I had been practicing, I'd been practicing UX for about 5 years, and everywhere I was taught, I started actually at Accenture, and I was taught their process, and at all the other places that I'd worked at, I really did feel like I was kind of turning the process inside out. So I was very nervous about publishing this, but I got a whole lot of really great feedback. It was one of the top 10 articles of the year on a list apart, and it was kind of my little 15 minutes of fame on Twitter. A lot of really famous people in our industry said really nice things. So I was like, okay, I need to keep working on this. And that's basically what I've been doing for the past 5 years. I've been writing about it. I've been talking about it. I've been talking about it on my podcast. I've been talking about it on stages all across the world when traveling is a thing, at conferences and within companies. So I've taught it within companies, and I've brought it as a consultant to multiple companies, big and small. Most recently, I actually got to this is the end of last year, I got to go to Facebook and work with them. And my big focus this year has been the strategist certification program. So I'm on cohort 3 now, which starts on September 30th. So the reason I started this program is because what I wanted to be able to spend more time with people. These 1-day, 2-day workshops just weren't enough to really kind of dig into the entire process. There's just, guys, I just got a lot to give. So this program was born. It's a 10-week program. It's very rigorous. And I am got 4 spots left in cohort 3. So if you're interested in that OUX strategist certification, I'll be talking about that a little bit more near the end. Okay, so before we go into the weeds on OOUX, I just want to let you guys know that I hear you, and I want to make sure that I am attacking the problems that you're actually dealing with. So I want to make sure the right people are in the room here. So I've actually been that question that I've been asking. This is my third iteration of this presentation, and that question that I ask when you sign up for that, what is your biggest challenge in UX today? I've been trying to find patterns there, and I've been very excited to see that a lot of the patterns that I've seen are things that OOUX can 100% help out with. 100%. Some of them not, but I want to make sure that I got the right people here. So I'm going to go through some of these patterns that I've seen, some of these big problems that I've seen people say that they have about their work as a UX designer. And if this isn't resonating with you, guys, I'm not going to be looking at that number. It is fine if you want to drop off. No hard feelings at all. I don't want to waste your time, okay? So one thing that I hear over and over again, this is not just from that one question survey that I've been asking people that have been signing up for this tasting flight. This is also coming from being a co-organizer of Ladies That UX for 5 years, I think 5 years, something like that. I also started the UX Hustle Summit and the UX Hustle Club. So I do a whole lot of mentoring and talking to people that are coming into UX design. So I listen a lot. I hear a lot of I hear a lot of venting. Let's put it that way. So one of the main things that I hear is that I want a better seat at the table, guys. I want to be doing more strategy work. I feel like I don't have all of the information. I'm doing a lot of guesswork in design, and I'm just sort of pixel pushing and like moving things around, and it feels really arbitrary. I don't feel like there's a clear framework, and I don't feel like I have the full picture. I want to be working more at a strategy level. So if you are feeling like that, I would ask you, do you really, really understand the business model? And when I say the business model, I don't mean the like how the company makes money per se. That's part of it. But how do all the pieces come together? Do you really understand? Do you fully understand the mechanisms of the business? And if you don't, and if you find that maybe you only understand parts of it, or if it's difficult to understand the business, especially as a consultant, if you're coming into different businesses constantly, or if you're just working in a really complex environment, this can be really difficult. And OOUX actually helps with this by going through the process of figuring out what are the objects, and when we talk about objects in OOUX, we're not talking about components. We're not talking about drop downs and calendar pickers. We are talking about the real objects of value, the business objects. So making sure that you can identify what those are in your system and how all the pieces relate to each other is a very, very good way to understand the business model so that you can be working at a more strategic level. So another pattern that I hear a whole lot of is this idea of, in the beginning of a project, I'm starting a UX project and I'm totally paralyzed by all the complexity. I'm organizing a lot of information. There's a whole lot of complex processes that I just don't have time to understand before jumping in. And I'm balancing like all this. I'm basically trying to take in a lot of information. And I'm sure you guys have experienced this before, where often as UX designers, we are kind of expected to be business analysts too. We're expected to be business analysts. We're expected to be master facilitators. We are expected to take in a whole bunch of information. Often, I mean, how many times have you gotten put on a project and they're like, here's the Basecamp login, or here's the Google Drive folder, and you open up the Google Drive folder and it's like, oh my God, what is all of this stuff? It's like Keynote files that you have no idea you even made this Keynote, like folders of screenshots of competitors with like annotations on it. And then there's like an Excel file from some Accenture analyst that they made, a bunch of business requirements six or 7 months ago. And then there's like the wireframes from the UX designer who left a few months ago, and you're inheriting those too. And you're supposed to kind of take all this stuff together, and maybe some user interview recordings too, maybe some of those notes from like, maybe you had a kickoff and you have like all these pages of handwritten notes that you're just trying to keep up with this kickoff. Like, I get that. Okay. I totally get that. I've been there so many times where I'm just dropped into a project and I'm expected to synthesize all of this information and understand all this information and then kind of turn it into design, turn it into wireframes very quickly, like turn all of it around and make all these parties happy, make all 18 parties happy. It's a very, very difficult thing to do. So what I would ask you though is, do you actually have a synthesis phase in your process? So taking all that research, so whether it's the desk research that you're doing, taking stuff, I mean, research can be considered looking at the previous UX designers' wireframes. Do you have a place to start where you say, here's what everything is existing. How do I synthesize that and turn that into information architecture, or turn that into additional questions for research or additional questions that you need to bring back to your stakeholders so that you can, when you come back to your stakeholders, you can ask these like surgical level questions because you've had a really good process for taking all of this information in. So that's what OOUX is really good at helping you do, is it does give you this starting place to say, let me take all this information in, figure out what we know can turn into structure for design, to basically turn it into information architecture that your design can like hang on. And then what do I need to take back to research? So even though we're often being asked to do a crap ton of stuff as UX designers, we're asked to be the business analyst, we're asked to be this master facilitator, we're asked to bring all this stuff together. If you can do that though, there's your seat at the table. There's your promotion right there. If you can do that gracefully, if you can actually bring all that stuff together and do and be all those things, it seems really overwhelming maybe right now. But if you can do that in a collaborative, even like game-like, fun way, you're winning. You're absolutely winning, and you're invaluable to your organization, and you're invaluable whether you're internal or as a consultant. So another piece of this, which all these kind of like feed into each other, there's sort of like a big, could make like a big overlapping Venn diagram. This idea of managing your higher ups, managing your stakeholders, making sure you ask them the right questions, leaders sort of pivoting right in the middle of a project, throwing their opinions in the mix like halfway through, not really defining a system before you start designing, so you kind of end up with a whole lot of rework. How do we deal with this? Okay, so if this is something that you feel like you are dealing with, what I would say is, do you have super clear frameworks for collaborative extraction of ideas and business rules? So do you know how to get everybody in the room and put them through a meat grinder? Sounds terrible. That's a metaphor, okay? So you get everybody in the room and you have a way to get all of these brains and all of these parties that all have different thought bubbles over their heads, and grab those thought bubbles and put them into sticky notes and arrange those sticky notes in a color-coded way that you can actually turn into additional questions and you can turn into information architecture. And then you can input all that Google Drive folder that you have, or that Basecamp login that you got. You can take and you can blend all of that information together into actually a single visualization. That's what OOUX helps you do. It's called object mapping. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing. We also build some other types of artifacts, like a system model, which is basically an entity relationship diagram. And we're going to go into the process in a minute. But that object map helps you, when you know how to collaboratively build that object map with your stakeholders, with your business folks, with your developers too. This framework is going to basically help you with all of these things. So you have clearly defined what the structure of the thing is, and you can get all those opinions out early. So your leaders aren't coming in and doing what we call the swoop and poop. They come in late in the game and they're like, oh, well, let's do this instead. And they pivot, or they bring on their own opinions, and it's not based on anything. If you have a process to wrangle them into submission in a really, really collaborative and actually playful way, then once you show those wireframes, that wireframe review is boring, because your wireframe review is everybody's just looking at it. They're like, yeah, this is exactly what we talked about. Like, please continue. That's what you want, right? You want the wireframe to be no surprises. But And you want the feedback and you want that extraction happening before you do those wireframes. So you don't want to be playing the game that I lovingly call the bring me a rock game, where you kind of talk to some people and you try to pull some stuff together, and then you just do a bunch of guesswork, or like, some informed guesswork on your wireframes. And then you bring the wireframes back and you're like, is this kind of what you're thinking about? Is this the sort of rock that you're looking for? And they're like, no, I think I want a bigger rock, or no, I think I want a smaller rock. And then you kind of go and you find another rock. That's not the type of iterating that we want to be doing, right? We want to be iterating really strategically. So do you have a clear framework? Another one, communicating with developers. So I need to understand how to hand off to developers. I want to communicate better with developers. I already talked about this a little bit, about how object-oriented UX does help you communicate better with developers, because your developers are thinking in objects. And this collaborative framework, this is something that you don't just bring your stakeholders in, you bring your developers in too, get them involved really early. And the other thing that this object mapping does for you is it's a way of visualizing a database. So I've spoken at dev conferences before, and they have taken this methodology, developers have taken this methodology, and they use it to help design their database. But you can do it from a user-centered perspective and from a business-centered perspective, and gloriously also from a technology perspective, getting all of these things lined up, the technology, the business, and the user needs, line them all up within this object map so that you can then build your wireframes from that. So do you understand the basics of how databases work? Maybe you do, and that's great. Do you really understand metadata? And when you are doing your wireframing, are you considering how the database is working? And are you bringing your developers in so that they can tell you, we don't have access to that piece of data. That piece of data does not talk to that piece of data. These two objects cannot actually connect the way you want them to connect, so that you can figure that out earlier rather than later. Okay, another one, no time for research, and like just going off and doing design without doing the research. I hear this time and time again. And what I would say is, are you selling research by exposing high-risk assumptions? So often I hear people selling research or talking about trying to sell research when I ask them, well, how do you try to get research? If you feel like your organization isn't doing enough research, how are you going about it? And a lot of it is very vague. Like, we need to understand our users better. That's not how you sell research, saying we need to understand. Okay, so what? Like, what is it going to give me if we need to understand our users better? Or showing statistics on, like, this is the ROI that you get on user research. What you want to do to really sell research is you bring your stakeholders, you bring your business folks into that collaborative session, and you expose the complexity to them. So when you go through this discovery round of the Orca process, which is objects, relationships, calls to action, and attributes, when you go through that discovery workshop with them, complexity cannot hide. There is no way complexity can hide from this process. So they understand the complexity, and they understand those high-risk assumptions that you are making. The questions just bubble up. All right. So when you go through the process with them and they understand those questions as well, and you're not just saying, we need to understand the users more, you're saying, we don't actually understand the relationship between chiropractors and the chiropractic practices. So does a chiropractor, are they only a part of one practice, or does a chiropractor actually join many practices? And do practices, do they have multiple locations, or do they have one location? And we don't really understand that, and we need to build software based on that. So when you can have a laundry list of all these questions that you're like, this is going to be a bad idea to move forward, you can make that very clear. And through that extraction and that of complexity, and through that creating that list of high risk assumptions, it's going to be very, very difficult for somebody to say, no, we don't have time for you to go and do 2 more days of user interviews or 3 more days of user interviews to go figure out the answers to those questions. Okay, so iteration, getting a team comfortable with iteration and scoping to that solid MVP. So when we're talking about iteration, I often see people wanting to iterate feature by feature instead of by fidelity. So, and figuring out, okay, what exactly is that MVP? What do we start with? How do we know what is high priority and what's not high priority? So what I would say is, are you iterating holistically by fidelity and not by feature? So in OUX, basically we go a little bit forward. We think about what is the ideal system, but we think about it in a very abstract way first. And abstract's not the right term. In a very low fidelity way. So we think about the entire system, very low fidelity, all in sticky notes and diagrams, and then we scale that back. So we say, okay, this is maybe where we want to be eventually, but this is where we're going to be now. Okay. So instead of saying, let's just start with this one little piece here, and we're going to design and we're going to develop and we're going to release that. And then we're going to go to the next piece, and we're going to design and develop and release that. And then we're going to go to the next piece, and we're going to design and develop and release that. Then what you get there with that kind of methodology is you get Frankenstein design. You get this like feature add-on where just everything's kind of glommed together, but because you haven't really planned the full picture yet. So instead what we can do is we can say, all right, here's what we want to build. We're going to build this, and we're going to build this at sort of low fidelity. All these objects might not have all the attributes. They might not have all the relationships that we want, but we've kind of planned that out. And then what we can say is we can say, all right, now that we've launched this, we're going to add this one other object, or we're going to upgrade this other object. So instead of iterating by feature, you're actually iterating by object. Okay. So if you're thinking yes to all of these, or even just yes to one of these, awesome, stick around. I've got a present for you, and that's ObjectOriented UX. ObjectOriented UX is this philosophy for designing digital systems that really respects the fact that people think in objects. And because people think in objects, people need consistent and recognizable objects to understand an environment or a product. So OOUX basically deliberately aligns, what we do is we deliberately align our software to the user's real world mental model of these concrete and defined objects. So we figured out what are the things in the user's world. So when they go and they look at the software or the website or the app, they're basically seeing a one-to-one relationship there. They're like, oh yeah, these are the things in my world, and this is like how they connect in the real world. So this makes total sense. And they don't have to learn something new. Okay. All right. So this is also what I call the secret weapon for breaking down complexity. All right. So what are objects? So what are objects not? These are not objects, all right? These are UI components. This is not what we're talking about, all right? OOUX is not your design system. OOUX can help inform your design system, though. Objects are not your calendar picker and your star rating. Those are not your objects. The event is the object. The thing that is being rated is the object, whether that's an article or a song or, ooh, time to do yoga. Whoop, 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 getting kicked out. What I want you to take away from this is the calendar picker is not the thing that your user is coming for. No user is, you can design the best calendar picker in the whole wide world. Your user is not coming to your site for your calendar picker. They're coming for the event. They're coming for the things that actually have value. And those are the things we want to make sure that we identify and that we're really, really clear on. And that the entire team is really clear on. And the entire team all agrees that these are the things. Okay? So objects are these real world things of value. So think people, places, things, and content types. Okay. Those are the things that people are actually coming for. If you're interested in more about the difference between the design system and OOUX, I also have an article on that on Medium. Okay, let's talk about how OOUX can help. All right, let's get to the fun part. So OOUX can help you increase your team alignment by finding and defining those valuable objects, reducing rework by tackling complexity early on with this very special framework that we're going to talk about today, and increase efficiency. And you're going to do that by eliminating extraneous moving parts. Okay, so let's talk about team alignment. So big problem that I see all the time, and basically every single organization that I've ever worked with, is calling the same thing lots of different things. Okay, so when I was working with Delta, we'd have a thing X, and somebody over here would call it a segment. Somebody over here would call it a leg. I'm over in the corner like, isn't this just a flight? What's the difference between a segment and a leg and a flight? And then someone else is like, oh no, I think we call that a route or a trip. Are these the same thing? Are these different things? What is this thing? Okay, so all the people on the team have have a different label for this thing that we're looking at, or a different idea of what this thing is. And then on the flip side, we have calling different things the same thing. Okay, so we have thing Y, and we call this a benefit. And then we have thing Z over here, a different thing, similar but different thing. And somebody else is saying, no, our team calls that a benefit. This is a benefit. And then we usually do these things in combination, which makes communication real fun, okay? Where you're basically, you have some people calling two different things the same thing, and then other people calling the same thing two different things, and you're trying to design complex business software, okay? And you're trying to communicate with each other. Sometimes you just need to build a glossary and be very, very clear on what the things are. So if you don't have a glossary, pro tip, go and make a glossary. Do that tomorrow. Make sure everybody understands what the things are. Focus on those nouns. What are the nouns and what are the things of value within your system? Make sure that those are defined and everybody's calling them the same thing. And everybody has the same definition of those. So get your nouns right first. So this is the big piece of OOUX is nouns before verbs. Verbs are, there's no point in the nouns without the verbs. The verbs are so important, but it's so much easier to build software and to build complex digital systems if you figure out what the nouns are in the system and then figure out what users want to do to those nouns. Okay, the nouns are the direct objects that users do things to. But instead of just going and figuring out all your task flows and all your user flows and all your user stories and your journey maps and all those things, what are the things in that environment? What are the things in that journey map? And then build the journey map and then build the task flows and build all the UI. Okay. So how we do this is we do noun foraging. So as you're going through that crazy Google Drive folder or, a Basecamp login, Basecamp project that maybe has been going on for a year and a half when you get in there, or you have very little. All you have is a marketing website to go on. I've been there before where you have very little to go on. Go do some noun foraging. Go find those nouns that get used over and over and over and over and over again and start finding the synonyms. Okay, so are these things the same thing? Are these, and if you're not sure, it's a good question to ask. Are these two things the same thing? Or are those two things a different thing? Is a sample and a product the same? That was a question I was asking for a client called Blood Relay. So they actually build software that helps blood labs and hospitals communicate. And they use the term sample and product and almost interchangeably, sometimes interchangeably. And it became very confusing for me. And I had to make sure that I understood the difference between those. And there is a difference between them. Okay, so that is some of the first best questions to ask. If you don't understand whether two things are the same or different, look for those synonyms. Make sure you can start untangling that. Wonderful place to start in a UX project is noun foraging and getting to that short list of objects that you can start creating definitions for. Let's think of an application that is helping people book COVID tests. I hung out with somebody recently who was like, oh, and then they called me and they were like, oh, I have COVID. And I was like, do I need to get a test before I go see my parents? I don't know. It turned out to be fine, but I couldn't figure out how to do it, actually. I couldn't figure out a good place to go where I would get results quickly. So if we're doing this, like let's say we have a business like CVS or something, and they're going to, launch a new app that helps people book their COVID tests and get their results back. And then we have users, and you have this is basically all we have to go on. What kind of nouns do you see here? What kind of objects do you think might be part of this new application that CVS or Walgreens might be launching? So just go ahead and I'm just going to give you a minute. I'm going to take a drink. Locations, appointments. Yes. You guys are getting it. So people, the actual tests, the family, the providers, the locations, the appointments, seeing appointments again, the tests, the appointments, the results. Ordering supplies. So maybe actually it's supplies and soap is a type of supply. So that's the basics of noun foraging. There you go. You just did some noun foraging. So it's not rocket science, but sometimes when you're going through a lot of information, you're definitely going to end up with coming up with questions as you go through this process, but you're going to come with really good questions. Promise. All right. So reducing rework. So let's move on to the second thing that I wanted to talk to you guys about. Reducing rework. I'm sure you've seen this type of graph before, the cost of change based on the project timeline. So early in the project, the cost of change is minimal. Later in the project, when we're like about to launch, the cost of change is astronomical. Okay. It's very, very expensive to change things. So what you want to do is you want to tackle all your complexity really early on. You don't want to sweep complexity under the rug and like look the other way and be like, I'm going to pretend that that's not there, because it's going to come back to bite you anyway. So you need a process to tackle complexity really early on in the project, before you're getting into screen design, before you're getting into wireframes, and definitely before you're getting into development. And so one thing that I would actually end up doing when I was, before I was using ObjectOriented UX, before I was using this process, is I would kind of start a project by like doing a lot of like low fidelity sketches on a whiteboard, lots of boxes and arrows. And I was kind of like trying to figure out these business rules, trying to figure out this complexity through the act of drawing screens or pieces of screens. Do you guys do that? And I still do it a little bit, but I do it a lot less, where I'm trying to sort of reverse engineer the issues by being like, okay, how would I design this screen? And then I like hit a question on like, okay, how does this tagging system work? Or is a post a campaign, or is a campaign a series of posts? Okay, so how does that work? But I'm coming up with these questions kind of through UI design, actually. And it's not the best way. It's not the best way because, one, you're multitasking. And we know what happens with multitasking. You do two things worse, right? So you're trying to design screens and you're trying to figure out requirements at the same time. So I found it to be so much better to, at a very low fidelity state, basically sticky notes, be like really breaking open all that complexity and finding all those questions early on, so that by the time you're getting into screen design, you just can kind of roll with it. Like screen design becomes really easy because you have all of your objects, you have all the attributes that need to be part of each object, and those go straight into your screens. And you definitely don't want to be asking these questions when you have, all of these sketch boards or Figma boards, right? So even when you're using symbols really strategically, change is tough when all of a sudden it's like, wait, an inspection can apply to more than one property. We didn't really talk about that. Shoot, now my system isn't going to really work. Or, appliances need install dates and also estimated replacement dates. Like nobody even mentioned, like in all these meetings, nobody ever mentioned that. How did nobody ever mention that? And now they're just seeing these like high fidelity screens and they're noticing that. And we really can't blame our stakeholders for this, because what happens is often when they're looking at our wily sketches, our really low fidelity comps, or our sketches or our whiteboard scribbles, it's hard for them to see that, right? So they're trying to look at the UI, and then it's not until they see something that's more real like this that they realize, oh wait, is it going to be able, where's the install dates? So what if we could answer all these questions a whole lot earlier? So this is what ObjectOriented UXers do. We ask these questions before designing a single screen. So here's the questions that we ask. We ask, what are the objects in the user's mental model? No surprise there. What are the objects' relationships to each other? Okay, and we talk specifically about cardinality of the relationships, which we're not going to get into today, but that's basically like, does this thing have many of these things, or does this thing have one of this thing? Okay, so it's those has-a relationships that developers like. We like them too. What calls to action do objects offer up? So what are the affordances of these objects? What can people do to these objects? This is where we get into functionality. So we think about the nouns first, and this is where we're starting to figure out what are the verbs, what are the things that people can do to these objects? And then what are the attributes that make up these objects? So now we've put each object under a microscope, and we figure out, okay, if appliance or asset or apartment asset is an object, it needs an expiration date and it needs an install date. That's metadata that we need to have on these, so we can make sure to get that in our freaking wireframe early on. And when we design our wireframe, we have a nice laundry list of, okay, here when I design my appliance detail screen, here's all the things that need to be on it, and we've all talked about it, and it's all been approved collaboratively. So then when I show these wireframes, everybody's just going to say, yep, looks good, keep going. So these 4 questions align to my very favorite acronym of the whole wide world, and that is Orca. So Orca stands for objects, relationships, capabilities, or CTAs, and attributes. And there are 4 rounds of the Orca process, okay, guys? We have round 1, that's discovery. Discovery workshops are amazing for smoking out complexity, making sure everybody understands all of the complexity and that you can really generate all the questions, okay? So you're generating as many questions as possible early on. The next round is requirements, and really between discovery and requirements, usually there's gonna have to be some research in between there. You usually are going to come up with so many questions within that discovery phase that you can go back and do really kind of surgical research where you can ask very, very specific questions to your users and to your subject matter expert. And each of these rounds, we're hitting on the objects, relationships, CTAs, and attributes. So we kind of iterate through them, right? And then round 3, we go into prioritization. So this is where we iterate strategically. We figure out, okay, we've figured out this whole system. Now let's figure out what we need to develop in the next 4 months. All right. What do we need to get out immediately? What do we need to get out in the next 3 weeks even? So we prioritize from a user perspective. So what's most important for the user and what's most important for the business? And then finally, we get into sketching and prototyping. So this is where we bridge into design. Okay. So this is 3 rounds of the Orca process before we start actually designing any screens. But then when we start doing the screens, it just nicely flows because we've done all that figuring out beforehand. So where does this fit? So you have your research diamond and you have your design diamond. So if you've never seen this before, it's basically this idea of diverging on research. So understanding the domain and the context, converging down to define the problem. Then once you've defined the problem, you start brainstorming solutions, you diverge, you come up with a lot of different solutions, and then you refine down to a single solution. And what magic happens in between? This has always been the mystery. And this is probably the weakest part, I believe, of our design process. A lot of companies are really good on the research side and really great on the design side, but they're not very good on the synthesis and figuring out, okay, we've defined the problem. Now we need to do some information architecture work, and we need to take that problem and we need to just distill it into information architecture. And that's what the Orca process does. So I like to say you can ride the killer whale from research into the design. And also, you can kick stuff back to research. This is almost like a gauntlet or a gatekeeper here to say, you know what? We can go to some parts can continue on design, but like we need to figure other things out. So some other things need to go back into research. And if you've been really collaborative with this process, okay, with your stakeholders and with the people that are building the project plan, you've been really collaborative and brought them into this, they're going to have perfect buy-in to say like, yeah, I understand that that these are all really high risk assumptions that we need to make sure that we get full understanding on before we continue going on. So this screen here is just to illustrate, this is from a portfolio. I have no idea whose portfolio this is, but this is from a redesign of the Zoo Atlanta application, okay? So here in this design, we have the home page. We can see that we can click on membership. We can see all the benefits of membership. We can join, we have a form, and then we've joined. And I'm looking at this redesign from a portfolio, and I'm thinking, is there really just one level of membership at the zoo? Like you just join and then you're joined? Is that all? So I go to the Zoo Atlanta webpage, homepage, membership page, and I see this screen, and I'm like, oh man, there's definitely more levels of membership. And so this is where the designer here had swept complexity under the rug. And then in the name of like, I'm just doing a fast, low fidelity wireframe here. But this is not where we want we want to have visual low fidelity. We do not want to have low fidelity as far as we don't understand the full way that the business works, okay? We don't understand the business rules. We don't understand how this thing is actually constructed. That's just a waste of time, and you're going to have to redo it. It's going to end up in rework. So one of my very favorite testimonials of all time was I had a junior UX designer leave a full day workshop, and she said, now I feel like I can tackle any level of complexity. I know how to break down a problem. And that's what this process helps you do. So basically what we would do here, if we were OUXing this, is I would look at this page and I would realize that membership level is an object. Okay, it applies to a member. So a member has a membership level. Member has only one membership level at any given time. They can't have multiple membership levels at one time, or can they? Probably not. And then I would say, okay, what is a membership level made of? What are the attributes? We have a title, we have a price, we have the amount that's tax deductible, we have the number of adults, the number of children, the guest tickets, the band costs, whether they have the adventure passport or not. All right. And I basically would take these and I would put these into an object map. And we have some color coding in the object map. And I would also show the relationships between these. So I would show that we have a member account, and the member account has one member level, but a member level has many accounts that are associated with it. So I could go to the companion member level and I could see all the accounts there, probably from an admin perspective only, like end users wouldn't see that. And then I might have family member. So a member account could be, mom or something, but then she's got 3 kids and they're all going to different summer camps at the zoo. Okay, so she has this membership level. There's a family membership level. So now we're getting into some of the real complexity here. And now I can actually, if we're just redesigning just the membership and how membership works on the Zoo Atlanta, I might have these 3 objects, and I might need to really work with the business to see how do family members work within a member account. Okay, that's a simple object map. This is a more complex object map. Sometimes an object map takes an afternoon to make. Sometimes it takes 8 weeks to make, like this one. This was a very collaborative process with the technology team as well. We use Trello a lot. So Trello is actually a really good way to build an object map because you can put additional information in each of those cards, which is super fun. Okay, so we don't want to have to do that kind of rework. All right, so the final thing I want to talk about is increasing efficiency. So how can you be the person to increase efficiency within not just your process, but also the end product itself? So what we want to avoid is we want to avoid shapeshifters. So in the longer presentations, I talk about actually 4 things that we're going to avoid. There's masked objects, shapeshifter objects, isolated objects, and broken objects. We're just going to talk about shapeshifters right now because they're my favorite. So these are objects that change shape arbitrarily. They're reordering and changing the display of their attributes. So the example that I love to give, there's so many out there on the internet. You'll start seeing them now that you're going to become aware of them. And it's something, I'm sorry, you can't unsee this now, but I love picking on Meetup. So on Meetup, you have the event object, and that event object shows up on the calendar list. It also shows up in the homepage banner, and then on the group page. The same thing is basically manifested in 3 different places. And that's fine, but the problem here is we're representing this so vastly differently in each of these places. So let's just look at the time. So when do I have to be there? When do I need to show up? So I have date and time over here in the upper left. Then I have time over here and on the right. And then I have it back over on the left, but it's concatenated with the date and it's in a different color. So the user can never really learn like just where to look to find the date and time. They have to sort of scan. They have to use their slow thinking instead of their fast thinking. They can't sort of intuitively basically use what they learned in the past to apply what they learned in the future, to apply what they're seeing in the present. Ooh, got there. Okay. So let's look at another one, just how I show whether I'm going or not. So I have yes and a green check mark. I have your next event. And then over here, I have going with a different green and a different check mark. The location changes places. Basically, everything changes places. The host is, above the title, then below the title. And what this does is it does 3 things. And makes life harder on the designers because you just designed 3 things when you could have designed 1 thing. It made life harder on the developers because they had to develop 3 things. And QA too, they have to QA all these things, and maintenance too. So now you're maintaining 3 things instead of 1 thing. And it makes it harder on your users, guys. Now your users have to learn 3 things instead of just the 1 thing. And if you're coming from a visual design background and you're thinking, well, wouldn't it be kind of boring like if the event just looked the same everywhere? And I will say to you, that is your ego talking, all right? Just like no user is coming to your website to play with your calendar picker, they're not coming for the design. They're coming, they want the design to be nice and ergonomic and pleasing on the eyes, but they're not coming to like see you play with the design. okay? They're coming to get stuff done. And moving stuff around for, you know, your creative, your creative fulfillment is not helping the user, okay? So we need to be as consistent as possible. So here's another example. This is from HelloFresh, I believe. And here's my upcoming meal that's on my dashboard. Here's my past meal in the cookbook, and here's my past meal in order summary. And you can see things are just sort of shifting around. Small things are shifting around, nothing major, but it gets really weird when I go into the detail view. So when I go to the detail view from upcoming meal, I get this like slide out thing with like overview and recipe tabs. All right. And then when I go to the meal, if it's a past meal, or from order summary, I go to this completely different view, okay? And why? Why do they need to be so different? It's actually the same data except for rating the meal. Rating the meal is the only thing that has changed about this. So look at just all the, like, just from a design system perspective, all the changes. So like our arrows are different here. This icon is different. A note about serious food allergies. Our share icons are different. So not only are things mixed up and like I have tabs, right? I don't have tabs over here. The experience is totally different when I go to this, you know, the same thing. It's a recipe or a meal. So let's do this. Let's just make them look exactly the same. How about that? Okay. And over here for rate this meal, for an upcoming meal, maybe we don't want people to rate it. So you could say, let's just get rid of it. So rate this meal doesn't show, but I like something a little bit better than that to actually gray that out a bit. And instead say, you'll be able to rate this meal after it's delivered to you. So now we're actually teaching the user where that rating is. And then it's reinforced, or it's already reinforced once we can't actually rate the meal. All right, and we just made less work for everybody, less maintenance, less work for the user. We're all happier. We've just made a much more efficient system, and we've made our process more efficient too, because instead of designing page by page where we end up with all of these different manifestations of objects, we can design object by object and keep our representations of our object super freaking consistent. So like I mentioned, shapeshifters are not alone. We've got our broken objects. We've got our isolated objects. We've got our masked objects. So real quickly to fight back, for our masked objects are basically the same way. The shapeshifter object is the same object represented in different ways. Our masked object is different objects represented the same. So 2 different objects or 3 different objects all wearing the same outfit, looking exactly the same. So you don't want to do that. That's not where you want to be efficient. You want to make sure your objects are recognizable. Isolated objects comes from defining the relationships and actually paving the way for navigation through the relationships. That is the most intuitive way to navigate for a user, is through those real world relationships, not through a list of links at the top of your page. There's nothing intuitive about that. And then broken objects are objects that are not directly manipulable. So the CTAs are, you know, if I need to drink my water, I need to like click on a menu up in the left-hand corner, which is not how the real world works. If I want to drink my water, I pick it up, take a sip. And then of course our shapeshifter objects, which you were introduced to, we want our attributes to be consistent. And we do that by prioritizing our attributes and stick to that structure unless we have a very good reason. We don't want our shapeshifting to be arbitrary, and we want to be really conservative about it, because even if we do think like, well, over here, this attribute becomes more important than it did over here. Remember, you're sacrificing consistency and recognizability. So is it really worth it? Make sure to research that. Okay, so what does this mean for you tomorrow? What are you going to do with all this information? So remember the questions that you want to ask before designing those screens. All right, what are the objects? What are the relationships? What are the calls to action? What are the attributes? And remember that acronym. All right, burn it into your head. And if you want to get a little bit more specific here, so what are your actual tasks here? So find your objects, guys. Go tomorrow, do yourself some noun foraging. Look at your current system that you're designing, and what are the objects in that system? And are you making it clear to your users? Look at your labeling. I've seen this in so many ways. You'll even label something one way in one page and the other way in another page. So one of my ed tech clients, they called it lessons over here and assignments over here. just call it lessons. Just call it lessons in both places. Okay. So just even like labels can help. So are you calling the same thing different things? Model your relationships with some boxes and arrows. Find those objects, draw them up in boxes, and start drawing arrows between them. Figure out what the relationships are between those objects, and then look at your navigation and see, well, there's a very clear relationship here between classes and students, but I can go to a class and I can't see the students that are in my class. I can't actually navigate to those students, or I can see those students, but I can't navigate to the detail page. Okay, what are your main flows and use cases? What objects are involved? So do a little bit of an audit there. Say, okay, here's what users are trying to do within this system. How directly manipulable are my actual objects? Can they do it if they're looking at that object, can they actually do it from the object? And are your attributes represented consistently? So fix those shapeshifters. So find them first. I'm sure you can find them. So go and see, like in your system, if you have, let's say you have a campaign object or a person object, all right, go and take a bunch of screenshots of all the times a person shows up, or an event, or whatever your objects are. Do an audit of those and be like, hey guys, we have 8 representations of this thing. How about we align that? How about we just have one, and it's going to make it easier on everybody? Okay. Orca, man, it's a beautiful thing.